Yesterday we learned the Gemara on that started on page 4, side A, and it continued on page 4, Daled, side B, Daled Amud Beis. And the Gemara was asking a question about our Mishnah, that what do the rabbis really hold when they translate the word b'shachbucha? Do they follow Rabbi Eliezer's way of understanding, or do they follow Rabbi Gamliel's way of understanding? And the conclusion of the Gemara is that they follow Rabbi Gamliel's way of understanding, except that they hold that there is a decree and it limits until Chatzos. And then we brought a Brisa that was supposed to somehow be a support for this idea that the rabbis have a decree against saying Shema after Chatzos. A person is only allowed to say Shema. Your time limit is until Chatzos. We tried to bring some type of a support to that from the Brisa, and that we discussed. How is it really supporting our idea? The Brisa talks about learning Torah. It talks about people wanting to eat, but instead they would go to shul and they would daven. But it doesn't really clarify what specifically the rabbis decreed and what really they were benefiting. But somehow it either shows that just like we see in the Brisa, the rabbis were concerned about missing out in saying Shema. So it makes sense that the rabbis were concerned as well. They would have made another issue because we see they're concerned. So therefore, it would make sense they maybe made additional decrees for the same reason, because we see they did have a concern regarding this issue. So possibly their decree there was to not eat before Shema. Another explanation is that they were supposed to say Shema right away when the time comes. But ultimately, we see that the rabbis were concerned that a person would forget to say Shema or fall asleep and not say Shema. And therefore, it makes sense that in our Mishnah, they had a similar concern, and they decreed that a person would only have until midnight to say Shema, and therefore it'll force them to realize the importance of getting it done, before the time, and have it done, ultimately do it without forgetting or falling asleep. And then we said that it could be that the Brisa that we brought is actually exactly what we are talking about, that Brisa is explaining that the rabbis made a decree until midnight in order that a person doesn't get involved in other things. He therefore should preferably say Shema right away. And because if he doesn't, he'll end up, in other words, the rabbis made a decree to say Shema before midnight. In this way, he'll probably realize the importance of getting it done, and he'll go to shul and he'll do it right away and won't end up missing out on Shema. So that was basically the Gemara from yesterday. And we are now going to continue on. We're about maybe 12 lines down from the top of the page. The word that we're starting with is my shna. My shna, why is it different? B'chol duchta, in all places, deloi katani chayev misa, that we don't tell people, that the rabbis didn't include in their decree the words punishable by death. In here, they included it. Why did they do that? Why is this so much more important for the rabbis to scare people? What's different about this decree? Maishna hacha, and why is here different? Diktani chayev misa, that it teaches that one is punishable by death if they don't follow the rabbi's teaching that they are punishable by death. Why did the rabbis say this term? So the Gemara says, "Ibayis ema," if you want, say, "Mishum diika oines shina," because there is a concept of sleep that takes you over and forces you to transgress the words of the rabbis. Therefore, they had to warn you with a more serious warning. Meaning, sleep is a major obstacle to saying Shema, and the rabbis saw sleep as a powerful obstacle, and therefore they said, you know what, we're going to add these words to our saying that whoever doesn't listen to the rabbis is, punishable by death. It's a very serious, listening to our decree is very serious. And they emphasized it. They mentioned it here because here they felt that if they don't, people, there's a lot going against them, which is the fact that people will end up falling asleep. The Ibayasema, if you want, say, La Afuke Mimanda Amar Tfilas Arvis Rishus, to exclude from the opinion that says that Ma'ariv is a optional prayer, and Kamash Malan, and it lets us hear from saying from these words in this brisa, it says that if you transgress Ma'ariv, pushing it off and so on, it's chayiv misa, person punishable by death, because it's letting us hear that it is an obligation, it's not optional. Now, the idea that Ma'ariv is optional and it's not an obligation is not applicable really today. It's not fully applicable today because we have already accepted it as an obligation on us. So for practical purposes, you can't rely on the optional opinion. Now, this brisa is giving a psak din. It's telling us that tfilas arvis is rishus, which means that there's an argument about it. There was an opinion that says it's optional, and there's another opinion that says it's obligational and obligatory. And the brisa here gives its verdict that it is an obligation, and that is shown from the fact that it says the rabbis made this decree and they made it, very serious, punishable by death. So I should mention that there is a Tosfos later on that says that no one really holds that Ma'ariv is completely optional. The only thought that it's optional is if you have another mitzvah that you could push off Ma'ariv to do another mitzvah. This is a Tosfos later on, and it's on page 27. Chav Zayin. Actually, it's on Chav Vav 26. And Tosfos basically holds that it's not necessarily optional. Here he says, that we say it's optional, it's relative to another mitzvah that's passing, that we say push off Ma'ariv before the other mitzvah. But for nothing, you can't just drop Ma'ariv.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I thought that the services were a substitute for an inability to do service in the main temple. So there's no korban that corresponds to Marav. So why wouldn't he have to show that it is, instead of saying there's no proof to show that it's optional, wouldn't he have to say that there's no proof to show it's required?
You're saying it's much more logical to say that it's optional than to say it's required. Is that,
Right,
is that
but
your
the
question?
purpose of the service is to replace our inability to bring korbanos. So there's no korbanos corresponding to the evening. So why would he take the position that it would have to be proven that it's optional as opposed to having to prove it's required?
Very good question. The answer is that that same source that you're bringing from, that the prayers are in place of the sacrifices, and you're mentioning that the sacrifices that were the communal sacrifices was one in the morning, one in the afternoon. The evening did not have sacrifices. So you're saying that it would seem like the Ma'ariv shouldn't be an obligation. But really, that same source that mentions about the sacrifices, it's in place of the sacrifices, it says that the reason for Ma'ariv is it's because it's in place of the fats and the limbs that were not consumed from before evening, that they are brought all the entire night. And so that's why, in other words, that this is in place of certain parts of the animal of the mincha offering.
Well,
so
my precise question, though, was not that. My precise question was, why does Tosafos take the position that you have to prove that it's optional as opposed to required, since the whole purpose, the original primary purpose of saying tefillos as a shachris and mincha was to replace the inability to bring korbanos. There is no obligation that I know of to substitute the fats with prayer. So why is he taking the position that you have to prove otherwise? That's my question.
But what about the Yaakov Avinu was davening Marav as not a substitute for korbanos? Not that that's the way. That's not that that's the reason that we do it, but that's a particular reason. It says Yaakov Avinu instituted Marav. That was before korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan.
Well, did he institute it as an obligation or as an option?
So
that's my question.
Yeah. So the truth is that both of these opinions. Thank you, David, for mentioning that. Both of these opinions. There's two opinions later on, and it's really not the topic of this conversation. It's really for later on. It's really for page 26, Chavav, where you have both opinions there. There's an opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and there's an opinion of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. And basically, one of them says that the patriarchs established the prayers, and the other one says that the prayers were established in place of the sacrifices. And so, the fact that the patriarchs established the prayers, that itself, would be logical that they all should have a certain obligation. And the question on that would be, what would the reason be for the person to say that it's not an obligation? And the question on the other one would be why, the other one, maybe we could understand a little more why it might not be an obligation, because it wasn't an actual sacrifice. It was just what wasn't done from before had to be finished. So maybe that would be more a reason for just the logic behind why it would be considered a more of a optional idea. But I'm not clear on what is bothering you, Manny. I don't know if I answered your question fully. I know we touched on the ideas, but you initially said your question. I gave you an answer. Then you said it wasn't really fully answered, and I don't know what was still bothering you. But if you want, we could wait till then. Should we wait till page 26 or? I guess that's really the topic of this. So maybe we should wait till there. Okay, so here,
Rabbi Smith,
yes,
I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure I understand this piece of the brisa about this liability for a death penalty.
yeah.
Okay, I want to make sure we're understanding this correctly. That this is not to be taken literally, correct?
That's my understanding. I didn't see much commentary about it.
I had commentary.
And I was, oh, you have a commentary? Good. What do you see?
It talks about, I don't, anyway, he talks about, Steinsaltz talks about that they wanted to create a fence around the Shema to protect Beit Israel. And so that this mitzvah wasn't neglected, not really to go and make death, kill people, but to teach them the obligation and to have them recognize that it's very severe and something that needs a lot of attention.
So does he explain why it uses that term, death penalty, and does it give a little
the magnitude of the transgression? It says the Gemara offers two answers, explaining that the conclusion of the Baraita essentially stems not from the magnitude of the transgression, but rather from concern that the fence created around the particular mitzvah may be neglected. That one returning from work, then they talk about all the sleep and everything like that. So it was more of a warning kind of a thing, but like how you have an Erev in certain communities, Shabbos and stuff, like that.
Right. Okay. Did anyone else see anything else? I don't know if anyone saw any other explanations in their Gemaras. I don't know other prints.
What
did you say, Jerry?
I'm trying to ask, is Marv of Rabbanon as opposed to Dioraisa davening?
Well, all the tefillos are, considered rabbinic. There is a mitzvah to daven when you need something, to ask Hashem for anything you need, but we generally consider the tefillos to be rabbinic. So that should answer your question. Shema is biblical, but the tefillos are considered rabbinic. Okay, so we've concluded this Gemara. I should mention
Rabbi Smith, one of the things that it says, this is also in Steinsaltz, I think where Miranda was saying, it says about Chayim Misa, it says clearly liable to receive the death penalty does not refer literally to a court-imposed death penalty, but rather comes to convey that one who transgresses a rabbinic pronouncement is deserving of death because he committed a transgression against Hashem.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, okay, that's what I wanted really to hear. Does it say clearly? Thank you, David. That really says it all. So as you thought, Howard, it's not literal. Although, the understanding I have from this Gemara is that the concept is applicable to all rabbinic decrees. It just mentions it here, meaning the idea that it would say whoever transgresses the rabbis is. I think there's another Gemara that says Yashchenu Nachash, a snake should bite him, which also means the same idea, that it would be punishable by death. I see the Rabbi Akiva Eger on the bottom. He brings a lot of sources. He doesn't tell you what they say, but if we had time, we could look up maybe some of those sources. It looks like he's quoting on this topic specifically that it says here, that a person is punishable by death. And they probably have other terms that those sources mention. But basically, it seems like that's applicable to all rabbinic decrees. But why the Gemara was asking, why specifically do we mention it here? Meaning, we don't always emphasize that, but it has an idea that it's like punishable by death. In other words, rabbinic decrees are very extremely important. In fact, the source of rabbinic laws are from the Torah itself, because the Torah itself says, "Lo sasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha." In Parsha Shoftim, we're not allowed to turn away from the thing that the rabbis teach us, and we're not talking about some rabbi of a shul here. We're talking about the Chachamim who established decrees. So
Rabbi
that's
Smith.
yes.
A person could ask a question, which, how come the entire Gemara, the entire Talmud, and Mishnayos, the beginning of it is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan and not mitzvah d'Oraisa?
But we're talking about Shema. Well, okay. Why?
Like in other words, if the entire Mishnayos and the entire Gemara is going to start with talking about Torah, why does it start with mitzvahs of the Rabbanan instead of mitzvahs d'Oraisa? I'm not suggesting an answer. I'm just throwing out a question related to like what we're talking about, whether it's the Rabbanan, d'Oraisa. Once more. Okay, I'm going to mute myself and listen to what you have to say.
No, David, very interesting point. I don't know if it's such a strong question, even if it would talk about the Rabbanan, but we are talking about Me'emasai Kairin Shema Bi'arvin. We are talking about a biblical law, which is d'Oraisa, because it's Shema. I was mentioning that the prayers might be. Prayers could be considered rabbinic, but the actual Mishnah is really talking about Shema. But I mean, not that it's a question. I don't know. To me, it's not. It wouldn't be surprising if the Gemara started with rabbinic law. So I'm not sure if I followed the full logic of that. But in any event. I did want to mention a few things. First of all, the brisa that we brought said that a person shouldn't come home from the field and he'll say, I will enter my house and I'll eat a little bit. I will drink a little bit. And sleep a little bit, and I'll read, sleep a little bit, and then I will read Shema, and sleep will take me over, and it'll end up that I'll sleep through the whole night. But rather, a person should come and learn, and then he'll say Shema, and he'll daven, and then he'll eat his bread. So the question is that from when is it prohibited to eat? Is it prohibited from the exact time of the Shema, or is it prohibited from before that time? There are mitzvahs that we consider, we add on a little extra time in advance. And the reason we add on time in advance is because we're afraid if you start eating now, you will end up leading into missing the prayer. So even though it's not the time yet, let's say, for example, checking for chametz, bedikas chametz, on the night before Pesach. So generally, the obligation of checking for chametz comes, let's say, at when the stars come out, or maybe shkia, and we wait a half hour before that from eating, because it's samuch, a half hour, we consider a half hour before, person shouldn't start anything. Because if you start something a half hour before, you might end up leading into it. So the question here is, let's say there is, if we follow this this brisa, which some place can bring down, that a person's not allowed to eat when it comes time for Ma'ariv, when would that obligation of fasting begin? So I want to clarify also that I mentioned yesterday that many people have accustomed to eat before davening. That applies to Shacharis. That's applicable in the morning. And I mentioned the reason why nowadays people are allowed to eat before davening it really doesn't necessarily apply to Mincha or Ma'ariv nowadays because you have all day to eat. You know, it's not like you have to jump and eat a meal right before Mincha or Ma'ariv. You know, it's not like you should be able to arrange your schedule, your day, to be able to eat something in a little before. You don't have to eat a meal right before Mincha or right before Ma'ariv. But the idea of that we're mentioning here is that Ma'ariv, there is actually a law not to eat before Ma'ariv. And
You
the
finished
question is, when
studying
does that
Daniel?
time, from what time does that
When is
start?
the exam?
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, when does that time start? So the top Tosfos says, from here it's understood that Misha'a, from the time that the time of Kriya Shema comes, you're not allowed to eat a meal. So Tosfos learns that it comes from actually that time of when you don't have to start earlier. When Ma'ariv time comes, that's when you can't eat a meal. But other Rishonim do say a half hour before, like it's mentioned by other laws, and that's one point. Another point that they bring from Tosfos says that it's prohibited to eat a meal. So the question was, in the Bryce, it seemed like you're not even allowed to eat a little bit, because the example that the Bryce gave was, I'll go to my house, I'll eat a little, I'll drink a little. So the Tosfos here says, but the prohibition is eating a meal, which means that the way Tosfos understood it is a person might say that he'll eat a meal, he'll eat a little bit, but that's not what the rabbis prohibited. The rabbis prohibited that, in other words, the Brisa doesn't say clearly, it just says that a person might say that I'll eat a little bit. But what the rabbis really prohibited was a meal. They didn't prohibit eating a little bit. And that's the way Tosfos understands it, and that's the way most of the poskim say it. There is one opinion, Trumas Hadesh, and he brings down that it's actually prohibited to even eat a little bit, even a little taste. Te'ima, it's called, even a taste. He says you're not allowed to have. We don't paskin that way, but there is such an opinion that before Ma'ariv, you shouldn't even have a taste of anything. We should make sure to daven right away. And,
Rabbi Smith,
yes.
isn't there some wiggle room on the definition of what a meal is? Because does it require eating a bread, for instance? And in another instance, we know that when Yaakov gives the meal to Esav, it's not a meal until he drinks. So we hold that for a meal to be complete, you have to drink something with your meal. So if you don't eat bread or you don't drink, then there's no violation.
I'm not familiar with the leniency of drinking, not drinking, that exempts you. Not saying it's wrong. I don't really paskin, these type of questions, but there, if you look in Shulchan Aruch says it's prohibited to eat a half hour near the time of Kriya Shema of Ma'ariv, and if you started eating before that time, if you started eating after that time, you have to stop and say Shema without the blessings, and then you can finish your meal, and afterwards you read Shema with the blessings and daven. But you don't have to stop to daven, it says, because you started, since you started eating already. But if you didn't start eating, even if you washed your hands, you should stop, it says, to daven. And if you don't have time to in other words, if the time for davening is going to be over, it's already getting the morning, then you have to, of course, stop immediately for davening as well. Now, what exactly does a meal consist of? Let's see. This is chapter 235 of Eirach in Arachayim. Let's see, Mishnah Brura here. I'm looking in Sefaria, and I don't know why I don't see the Mishnah Berurah. Anyway, definitely we could look into this another time. I don't know offhand the exact details. I would believe it would be a size of a kabeya, but I am not exactly sure. But I don't have. Do I have it? No. I don't have it in front of me, and I don't want to waste any more time. I will, Mitzvah Hashem, look that up and get back to you. So those are the two points that I wanted to mention about either when the time begins and the idea if it applies to a meal or just to or even just to tasting. And now we're going to start the next Gemara. We're at the 2 dots. Amar Mar, Master said, Kairei Kriyashma Umespalo. You read Kriyashma and daven. So the brisa that we brought, it mentioned, maybe this wasn't the main point of the brisa, but it mentioned that what should a person end up doing? He'll go home. On his way home, he's going to stop off in the, comes from the field, and he's going to stop off in the shul. He's going to learn some Torah, and he will say Shema and daven. Now, the Gemara is not sure if when you daven Ma'ariv, are you supposed to say Shema first and then the davening, or do you say davening first and then the Shema? You have to understand that we have everything established, and we have Sidurim, and we know the final verdict of how things have to be. In the time of the Gemara, or before the time of the Gemara, things were, first of all, they didn't have Sidurim, and second of all, there were different opinions that we might not be, we think we know everything, but there were different opinions back then, and there were opinions that at night, you don't have to do it in this order, you could do it the opposite order, which means that you could say Shemona Esrei first, and then you would say the blessings on the Shema. So the Gemara here says, let's learn something from the Brisa, even though this wasn't the main point of the Brisa, but let's check out the way it words it and see if we can actually find a teaching that will tell us about the laws of Shema and Shemona Esrei, which one comes first. So the Gemara said, look at what you just said. You say, read the Shema and then daven. What does that show? That Shema comes first, and then comes the Shemona Esrei. This seems to support, this is a support to Rabbi Yochanan. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says, Ezehu ben olam haba, who is a person who merits the world to come. This is someone who is saimech, zehasaimech geula letfila shel arts. This is someone who brings close the geula to the tefillah during Ma'ariv, which means that Shema is all about geula, because what is the blessings of the Shema? Baruch atah Hashem, Go'al Yisrael. We thank Hashem for taking us out of Egypt, the Redeemer of Israel. That is the blessing of the Shema, the final blessing in the morning Shema, and the final in this the first blessing in the evening Shema is Go'al Yisrael. That Hashem, we thank Hashem for redeeming us. That blessing is of thanking Hashem for Yetzias Mitzrayim, for the exodus from Egypt. Now, that blessing that we say is normally said before the Shemona Esrei, before we say the actual prayer. So the Rabbi Yochanan says that if you want to merit the world to come, make sure to never interrupt between the bracha Go'al Yisrael and the Shemona Esrei of Ma'ariv. And then you will merit Olam Haba. If you're careful about this mitzvah, to always connect Go'al Yisrael and afterwards have the Shemona Esrei during Ma'ariv. Now, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, but Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi argues, and he says, Tfilos be'emtza tiknu. The Shemona Esrei is in the middle of the two Shemas. Every day we start with Shema and we end with Shema. There's a morning Shema and afternoon Shema. In the morning, we say Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, after the Shema. In the evening, we say the Shemona Esrei before the Shema. So it's like a sandwich. The Shema always starts the day, Shema ends the day, and the prayers are always the meat, the hamburger inside the sandwich is always the Shemona Esreis. So you have the two Shemona Esreis like a double hamburger, a double burger sandwich, and you have the Shema on top and the Shema on the bottom. So you have, that's how the prayers should be. Now, we aren't familiar with this, so some of you think this is crazy, but this is because we have a siddur, and we think that the siddur was around all the time, but it's not so. They used to not have siddurim, and there was an opinion. And this Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is a very holy tzaddik. He used to speak to Elijah all the time, and he held that the tefillos, the prayers, are supposed to be in the middle of the two Shemas. You start with the Shema in the morning, and the end Shema is later on in the evening, and that's Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's opinion. B'mai komiflagi, and the Gemara asks, so what is this argument? One opinion says that whenever you say Shema, you're supposed to say Shemona Esrei afterwards, and that would mean that it goes Shema Shemona Esrei in the morning, Shema Shemona Esrei in the evening. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says no. Shema Shemona Esrei in the morning, Shemona Esrei, and then Shema in the evening. And what is the argument based on? So the Gemara says, Ibayis Ema Kra, if you want, say it's a verse, it's based on a verse. Ibayis, if you want, Ema, say Svara, you could say it's logic. Ibayis Ema Svara, if you want, say it's logic. If you want Svara, I'm sorry. If you want to say it's logic, because the Rabbi Yochanan Savar Geula Meyorta Nami Havi, because Rabbi Yochanan holds that the redemption was also in the evening. Ela Geula Ma'al Yasol Lehavi, but it wasn't a good redemption. A proper redemption, ad safra loihavya ella ad safra. It didn't happen until the morning, which means that the evening geula was evening redemption was a redemption, but it wasn't complete until the morning. It wasn't the real redemption. We didn't leave Egypt until the morning. What does this mean? Well, if you remember the story of the Exodus, what happened? The smiting of the firstborn happened on the night of Tesvav of the 15th of Nisan. And the next morning is when the Jewish people actually left, the next day. And in the middle of the night, after the smiting of the firstborn, Pharaoh came to Moses and he told him, get out, leave already. And Moses told Pharaoh, he said, no. We leave when we want, not when you want. We're going to leave in the middle of the day when everyone sees us. We don't have to sneak out of Egypt. We're going to leave in broad daylight. And that is the story of the Exodus. So what does that mean? When were we redeemed from Egypt? We could have left at night, but we didn't. We left in the day. So the understanding is if we left during the day, then the real redemption was in the day. But at the same time, there was a partial redemption. We sort of felt totally free at night. So because of that, there is a partial redemption at night. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, I'm sorry, let's start with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that the redemption at night is also considered a redemption. It's just not a complete redemption until the morning. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Savar, we're now on the second wide line. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Savar, second wide line on page Dalet Amud Beis. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi holds, Kivan delay havya elamit safra, since it didn't happen until the morning, Geula ma'al yus, Kivan delay havya elamit safra, lay havya geula ma'al yus. So it's not a proper geula, it's not a complete geula. And therefore, it's not counted, it's not considered significant to cause us to connect the night geula with our tefillah. Meaning, what the Gemara is saying is that when we mention the redemption from Egypt in the morning, we are thinking of the redemption in the morning when we left Egypt. When we mention the redemption in Ma'ariv, what we are thinking is Hashem took us out of Egypt in the evening. Hashem, that was a redemption, and that redemption, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, no, even in the evening, we're thinking of the morning one. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, I'm sorry, I think I mixed up the names. Let me say that one more time. When we are saying the night geula, what are we having in mind? Meaning, when we daven Ma'ariv and we say the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Goal Yisrael, what are we thinking? So if we're thinking of the night geula, then it would make sense to put that redemption next to the Shemona Esrei, because geula, redemption, is supposed to be next to Shemona Esrei. But if we're thinking of not the night redemption, because we weren't redeemed at night, so then maybe we don't need to connect the geula at night when we mention Goal Yisrael. We don't have to connect it with the Shemona Esrei, because the night at night we weren't really redeemed. So it's not so significant to connect it to the Shemona Esrei, because the night geula was not really a complete geula, and we don't have to connect it to the Shemona Esrei. So we're thinking of the geula at night, and it wasn't really a redemption, or maybe it was considered a redemption, because the fact is they did give us permission. Pharaoh gave us permission, and he wanted us out. He kicked us out. We just didn't leave. But so is that considered a redemption to the extent that we should feel that we're connecting that redemption and that thanks to Hashem to the Shemona Esrei, that we should connect it to the Shemona Esrei, to the prayer. And that's the argument here if it's based on logic. And we are